I love the idea of people sitting around talking about giving and kind of,
Yeah.
but I think we can do better. We can talk about giving in a more meaningful way and really challenge each other and hold ourselves
Yeah.
accountable. And I feel like the kind of circle, with us, the donors, and them, the nonprofits, it doesn't set up a good
Mm,
dynamic where, I mean, yeah, I think I love the idea of if you're going to sit around with a glass of wine and talk about philanthropy, let's challenge each other to give more. Let's talk about the specifics that we're giving, why we're giving. Let's really have a conversation, a real
yeah.
conversation. And that will
Yes.
help, that'll serve the social appetite and, connection appetite that we all have and
Yeah.
want. Um, but bringing in a nonprofit and kind of forcing them through all these hoops is maybe not the
Yeah.
best way to kind of get that piece met.
Yeah. Well, and I think it speaks to the power dynamics that America's really trying to disrupt too, with the haves and have-nots, and are we constantly asking people to dance for our applause and our money? I mean, that's a terrible
Hmm.
image, but that is another concept that I could see at play in this sort of dynamic. Um, what do you think about donor advised funds? Because I know with your half my daft, there's also some, the other side of donor advised funds that is a drawback is that it really creates anonymity for the donor, and it can separate the relationship between the donor and and the nonprofit.
Hmm.
What are your thoughts on like that dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts now on donor advised funds. I think, well, in general, I think they're a great tool. I mean, they were set up as a tool so that you can, put your money in and get that tax break. And then you have it kind of as an organizing tool. So you can kind of give over time and figure out what you want to do. So
Yeah.
it's theoretically a great tool for people. But the problem that's happened, the biggest problem I think, is the money gets stuck in the DAF, and people aren't kind of giving it
Yeah.
out. And you ask about the anonymity. I think that often happens where donors don't understand that that's happening. But we've talked to a
Mm,
lot of nonprofits that say, yeah, we get this check from Fidelity or Schwab or whatever, and we don't know who that donor is, and that's the worst thing for a nonprofit. They get a nice gift and they can't thank the person, they can't build a relationship with that person. I mean, that's a real problem.
right.
And as a donor, as a person who opens the app, you're supposed to, like, you can put your name there. And I think most people, I mean,
Yeah.
from our mini research, it's like most people put their name, on the check, and as I think they should, because we should all be kind of more open with kind of our giving, not as a way to kind of necessarily as a way to kind of show that we're giving, but to start that conversation and make sure that we're out there with kind of what we're doing and what we care about. Um, yeah, that is a problem with donor advised funds, with the nonprofits not kind of connecting the dots and who's giving. Um,
Yeah. Do you find that the donor advised funds advisors are giving you that kind of strategic feedback and
that's
guidance about
no,
like,
That's the problem.
no?
I mean, so the donor
Okay.
advised fund sponsors, I mean, there's those three big national guys, the Fidelity, Schwab, and Vanguard, and then there's over 700,000 donor advised funds across the country. It's grown a
It's a lot.
lot. There's a lot, and the number that I mean, it used to be, for the very wealthy, that donor advised funds were kind of, you had to give a certain amount, and now you can open a donor advised fund with just $5,000, which is still money that you're going to give away. So that's something, but it's an easier entry point, and people are opening them, but then there's no one that's pushing that money through. So the financial advisor is not
Mhm.
saying, oh, you should start giving. No one's doing that, and that's really,
Nobody's reminding you
no
and
one's reminding you. And I think,
pinging you.
no,
Oh,
and what we've
interesting.
found is that people are either just busy, their life continues, and they've kind of forgotten they even have money sitting in a donor advised fund, or they have a long term strategic plan. They're giving thoughtfully over the course of 3 years or whatever, or 10 years, um, or they're just kind of holding on to it. There's some sort of, it's even though the money is no longer theirs, it technically needs to be given to a nonprofit. They still have control over it, and kind of letting go of that
Mhm.
control. It's very human, but that, and no one's kind
That's
of
funny.
pointing
That is
to it and
human.
saying, yeah, let's move that money through. And maybe this is a time where I should just briefly mention the Half My DAF challenge, and
Yeah,
why I know so much about DAFs and have been learning a
please,
ton about
please
DAFs.
do.
So donor advised funds are, it's like I think of them, I mean, like a charitable checking account. There is the money in the donor advised fund, and like I said, there are many across the country, and people aren't moving the money through. And there's over $120 billion stuck in donor advised funds. So my husband and I were kind of aware of
Just
sitting there
sitting.
because of
Yeah,
inertia or all these other things I described, and people aren't aware of it. And my husband and I wanted to raise awareness around that, but also, I mean, the reason we started Half My DAF is because COVID hit, and
yeah.
there was so much need, and the nonprofits were desperate. The need was greater. They're working harder than ever. They're pivoting to be online and figure things out. And there's no funding coming in. They can't hold their luncheons. They can't hold their galas. They can't, raise money the way they normally do.
Mm,
And my husband and I were just like, we need to start giving more to all sorts of nonprofits. And we wanted to do that. And we wanted to inspire and encourage other people to do the same. So we kind of connected this idea of helping move, being that the nudge that the financial advisors aren't being, to move that
yeah.
money out of donor advised funds and to the people who are putting that money to work, nonprofits. So we offered up $1 million in the form of matching grants, and inspired people. And technically it was a huge success. From May 5th to the end of September, we moved $8.6 million to nonprofits. So in
Yeah,
5 months. And so that's a
that's
success. But
awesome.
even better to me is the community it started to build, because we did webinars for nonprofits, kind of educating them about donors and donor advised funds. And we talked to donors themselves who were thanking us for the nudge. Like, thank you for raising
Mhm.
our awareness around this, and helping us, inspiring us to start giving. People saying, I'm
Mhm.
sitting around the dinner table with my adult kids because they're home, we're all sheltering in place, and we're talking about money in ways that we hadn't ever before. Talking about, where should we give? What are our values? So I love that the conversation has started around giving.
Yeah, I love that too, and I think that it's so important for us to get into all the topics that are taboo or unconventional or hard and awkward. I loved, the reason we're talking, Jen, is because of your beautiful book that was just released, and I've now read. It's called We Need to Talk, and it's all about breaking down those silos of wealth and opening up the conversation, stimulating conversation. I found that during the social injustice and unrest that our world is facing, it's hard to have conversations about things that you don't feel are universally acceptable or easy to talk about. And you challenge the reader with conversations at the end of every chapter, like questions about, here's a question to ask yourself or talk to your family about or ask your friend. What would you say is like the hardest conversation around money? Like, what topic is it that's the most taboo or
Hmm.
challenging to begin with?
Well, I think, kind of the more I've talked about money, the more I realize it's not money that we don't talk about. It's the emotions that we feel around money. Money is a very
Oh, I like that.
emotional thing. It brings up a
It's
lot. It's
charged.
very charged.
Hmm.
All of us sort of have money shame and money guilt, and we have a money story that sort of starts in childhood.
Yeah.
So we kind of learn about money, and whether it, all the, I mean, and it can be so varied, depending on how your parents kind of, their attitude towards money. So I think,
Yeah.
the emotions that come up are pretty universal. I mean, it's fear. We're afraid of hurting other people's feelings, or we're afraid of rejection. We're afraid of not measuring
Hmm.
up, or sounding unknowledgeable. So we kind of avoid the emotions that come up with money. And I've been thinking a lot about kind of how do we encourage people, because it is uncomfortable. I want to invite people to
Hmm.
get uncomfortable and have these
Yeah.
conversations, because on the other side, once you do connect, it's you find a new sense of connection. There's a sense of relief. There's a way to learn. Um, and I think, it's either, you have this awkward money moment where something comes up and you're like, "Ugh," you just avoid it, Or there's a lot
Yeah.
of things that, kind of hang over your head. Like there's ongoing money issues that you have with a parent or with your
Yeah.
friend, or, I mean, it could be, um, you have a friend who always wants to go out to a really expensive restaurant that you can't really afford, or your parent says to you, "You're going on vacation again. Can you afford that?" Or
Yeah.
your in-laws are giving to your spouse's brothers and sisters, but they're not giving to you. Or your
Mhm.
daughter wants to buy an expensive handbag that you know doesn't fit her budget or your values. Or if you go out with another couple and they're always talking about all the stuff they're buying. So all these are kind
Yeah.
of issues that come up and we just kind of veer away from them. But I have 5 steps I think can help us have those
Okay,
conversations.
tell us the 5
Well,
steps.
I think first is admit that it's an emotional thing that comes up for you. So
Yeah,
let's say it's that
call it
friend
out.
who, wants to go to the fancy restaurant all the time and you're like, so what do I really feel about that? Am I resentful? Am I worried that the friendship's, you know, going to end if I don't go? Or actually, I feel ashamed. I'm ashamed that I can't afford that. I have a good job. I'm, doing well at my work and I should be able to afford this. I'm ashamed that I can't. So you figure that out and
Mm,
you realize, okay, so that's the issue. I'm going to be vulnerable. I want to talk about this. So you set up a time. Step 2, set up a time that's,
okay.
emotionally neutral. So and give each other time. So set up that time, and then 3, at the beginning of the conversation, I think this is really important, acknowledge that it's uncomfortable, that you're about to
Mhm.
have an uncomfortable conversation. Give each other permission to fumble around, to say things wrong, to get messy, to not do it right. And just in acknowledging that, I think it builds a little bit of a safe space for you to have a conversation. And then, or, give each other time. Maybe it's 5, each of you gets to speak for 5 minutes uninterrupted. And then you explain, I realize that I feel really ashamed that I can't afford. I wish I could go out. I should be able to. I'm 35. I should be able to do that. Explain how you feel. And then you know what? Who knows what your friend might be feeling? This might be opening a door for them. Maybe your friend is like, "Oh my gosh, I have so much student debt. My rent is really expensive. I really can't afford it either. I'm going in debt. I'm so glad you brought this up." Or maybe they're like, "Oh, I had no idea. Let's go somewhere else, or let me pay this time," or who knows. I think we tend to tell ourselves stories and kind of make assumptions, and until we really confront what's going on, how are we going to move through it? And I think on that other side, it's then you can thank your friend, you can feel the gratitude, and I hope and I believe that you'll feel more connected to that person.
Jen, I love that. Thank you for walking through those 5 steps. Those remind me of, I've done training on nonviolent communication and conflict resolution and like couples counseling. And it seems like it's that really simple formula, but that people just don't engage in. So I'm
Hmm.
glad that you walked through those 5 steps and how to embrace that way of thinking of naming it, setting aside time, opening up and having a safe space for vulnerability, and just holding that space there and bringing that to the conversation of money. I just really appreciate that. Thanks for sharing that wisdom with me and with anybody who's
Yes.
listening.
Yeah,
I
I
like it.
just think, when we don't talk about something, it tends to loom large and take on a life of its
Totally.
own. And when we don't talk about money, we're giving it so much power. Let's take the power back
Yeah.
and put money in its
Yeah.
place.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. And it's like, as you say that, I'm like, this is so doable. How come I didn't think of that? I can totally
You
do
can do
that.
it. Try it. And
What about no, go
well,
ahead.
I'm just thinking because the reason I wrote the book is to share my story, because I think when
Uh-huh.
we hear other people's stories, we can understand our own better. And so if we shared
Yeah.
money stories with each other, I think we'd realize, oh, we're not the only one that overspends, or whatever it is you're worried about. It's like you'll realize, okay, it's okay. That other person's probably feels the
Yeah.
same way. We have a lot more in
Yeah.
common than we
Yeah.
think.
Yes, exactly. And our society pushes us to spend,
Yeah,
overspend, and
true.
spend, some more, and just be, more consumeristic, the
Hmm.
better. And so I think that's something that any group of people can relate to, and I appreciate that. There's I like what you said about just like putting money in its place and taking out the power, the charge behind it by just naming it and just, it deflates. It comes out.
Hmm.
You just name it.
With this latest valuable episode, we'd love to thank you for joining us on the Creating Community for Good podcast. If you found today's show valuable, simply visit our website, creatingcommunityforgood.com, to leave a review as well as to get access to additional resources and relevant links from this show. Stay tuned for more episodes.